everybody. Welcome back to the March 28th edition of the nbpolipod. My name is Joanna Killen, and we are here on the unceded territory of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Pescataway peoples in Manequist, also known as St. John, New Brunswick. Hello, Brent.
Hello, and I am your intrepid co-host, Brent Harris. Yeah, I'm giving myself a nice title here.
Yes, you are.
And welcome back, Joe. There was definitely some comments. Sean obviously wished you well and wanted to pass along his well wishes for you being out last week. So we're definitely going to have to get your hot take on the budget,
Yes.
which was our comment last week. But as you can see from this pod, we're talking about hodgepodge. And so for those of you on Rogers TV, you would not know this, but one of our, in our first few months, we were like, okay, what are we going to talk about on this podcast? What is the topic? And we were kind of like, well, Jesus, like there's all kinds of things to really mention and like rein in. And so we were like, let's just call it the hodgepodge edition.
Which Brent had never heard of what that was.
And I looked at you and I was like, hodgepodge. I'm like, I've heard of that, but what actually is it? Like, how do I find a graphic for hodgepodge?
And would you believe that dear Canva had a graphic for hodgepodge?
They did. Yes. It was in the banner. So if you guys saw the banner on this, great. If you didn't, we'll maybe bring up a graphic of it later.
And it's not much longer actually until hodgepodge is a thing. It's really the stuff from the first harvest. So once everyone gets out in their garden, starts planting things, it's those new potatoes, those new beans, fresh carrots, like everything that first comes out of the ground that you throw into this like cream-based stew. It's really good. I love it.
Well, so I hadn't had it before or heard of it. As like I didn't know it was a New Brunswick delicacy. I knew what the word hodgepodge meant, like a mixture of things. I didn't know that it was a delicacy, and I sure as hell didn't know it was a New Brunswick delicacy. But you know who else really hadn't had it before? Maybe I shouldn't say this out of turn. I think Andrea Mason, MLA.
Oh no, she knew.
So who was the other person who was like, you're right, I don't know what it is either. But Andrea actually was funny because she sent us pictures of her hodgepodge, which she made around that time. Yes. We did a whole survey of people who listened to the podcast, and it came back with like, there was definitely, a majority of people who knew what hodgepodge was, but there wasn't very many, like it wasn't very far behind that. Like, I don't know, like 20% were like, never had hodgepodge.
I know there's certain pockets of New Brunswick that are more unaware of the hodgepodge phenomenon. That is for sure. So this week we're bringing back the concept because, like you say, there's just so much to talk about, and there really wasn't one emerging theme on it. So welcome to a hodgepodge episode, and you will see these from time to time because sometimes there's just an overwhelming amount of things going on, and we just need to throw it all into one pot, basically.
That's it. And Sean Rouse and I, if you are wondering about the New Brunswick budget, go back to last week, and you're gonna hear about that. And
great episode, by the way. Very good episode. Loved it.
Thank you. You listened to your own podcast?
I sure do. I had to make sure you guys didn't burn the house down.
Oh, well, leave it to two men to really mess it up.
It's true.
So this week we are going to cover there's some questions that were asked last week about the budget we're going to get to. We'll give our hot take on that, that's the first thing on the docket. The second thing is your hot take on the budget, which we'll probably like come to on those Q&As anyway, but we want to get your take as the fearless co-host of this podcast, which we've been doing for over a year now. We're up to like 50 episodes.
Yes, it's wild. And like I appreciate that everyone wants to hear my hot take actually, and like it was great to see on Twitter all the questions we got.
Yeah.
It was probably the most amount of engagement we've really ever had on a specific topic. So definitely.
And it's funny because it continued on from like the week before when we posed the question, hey, where do you land on the political compass? And by the way, if you're a late bloomer to the political compass test, check the bottom banner here now, because you can see where you can take your political compass test so that you can figure out where you are at on the quadrants, the 4 quadrants that are kind of the more simple version. But I had somebody take me out to lunch today and say, "Here's my results. I listened to the podcast." Uh, anyway, so
Love it.
I love that carryover is still happening.
And actually, he is a podcaster himself. Am I correct in saying that?
Yep, Mark, and
Yes.
we'll mention that in our Patreon, our NB Politicos. But
Yes.
before that, we're gonna get the hot take. We're gonna talk about the carbon tax. We
Mm-hmm.
got into a heated debate with somebody at a coffee shop this morning
Mm-hmm.
about the carbon tax, which is always fun. Politics in real
Yes.
life, you gotta love it.
Gotta love it.
And then we're gonna really move into a discussion about the carbon tax writ large. We're gonna talk about the history. We're gonna talk about the recent announcement that Justin Trudeau did around a new renters' bill of rights and opportunities for renters to get some credit, let's say,
Yeah.
for their we'll tease that out, to get some credit for paying their rent, because you know what, if you pay your mortgage and if you pay, and you have insurance on your house for that, you get some credit. Like your credit score is affected by keeping your creditors in good standing. If you're a renter, that doesn't happen. So Justin Trudeau made an announcement about that. We're going to get to that, and we're going to kind of tip it off with Susan Holt and a little bit of a discourse that I had with Susan on housing and how maybe some of this works out for the New Brunswick Liberals.
Yeah. It's a little bit of it's all about the Liberals moment there toward the end.
Exactly. It's all about the Benjamins in the States. It's all about the Liberals right now in New Brunswick. Let's get into it. But before we do, a big thank you goes out to all of our Patreon friends. If you're looking to support this podcast, patreon.com/nbpolipod. We really love that support. It costs us somewhere in the tune of about 100. Well, no, it's a little less than that. It's about $80 a month, I think, for us to host this podcast between the two streaming services once we calculate the US dollars to Canadian dollars and all that. And we've been doing it for a year without asking anybody's help. And we were finally like, you know what?
Appreciate it.
There's a lot of people. There's like 170, 80 people who are chiming in every week. And so we appreciate all of you. And the shout out for our politicos goes to Mark Brewer, as you mentioned, who I had lunch with today. Which was great. He has his own podcast, New Brunswick Traveler, and you can find that on Spotify. And I do believe he's talking about trying to get on different platforms as well. Spotify is a pretty common one for people. Mark has tons of political perspective.
I believe he's had Councillor Ogden on his show. So one of
our
colleagues.
I think so too. I believe that's right. And he's from Arkansas. He's not a Canadian. He's come from away. But he's a social democrat. He's a libertarian social democrat on that political compass, for those of you who are savvy and remember that. So that is an interesting fit for a person from Arkansas. He's had a pretty crazy life. Another Politico, Sean Rouse, one of our most frequent guest, who has a staggering perspective on New Brunswick politics in many ways. Where would we be without Sean?
I really don't know. He's become an integral part of this podcast. There's no question. We just love having him on and appreciate his contributions and pragmatism. I always say calms me down as a person.
Yeah, he calms things down. He stands up for issues in a really clear way about what's right and wrong. But what I love about Sean is that he doesn't veer into the lanes that I tend to occupy, which is the combustible throw people under the bus lane. Shoot first, ask questions later.
That's part of your charm. We wouldn't be here without it.
Well, yeah. And then finally, Fred LaForge, thank you so much for you all, and to our supporters, Luke Robertson, as well as Jack Jones, and Chris Doyle and Sean Daly. You are signed up for the free tier. And you know what's funny about that? I didn't even know there was a free tier. So you guys found a new tier. Thank you for supporting us anyway. We are going to use that. We are going to use that Patreon to give shout outs to people. But enough of our own stuff. First
Let's talk politics, baby.
Let's talk politics. Now, I'm going to ask a question that we didn't get to last week on the budget, and you're going to be up for the first take.
Let's go.
You like that?
I do.
Okay. So first up, let me see here. Okay, so we had Darcy Wallace, Duke from Moncton at Duke from Moncton on Twitter. What did you dislike about David Kuhn and the Green Party reply to the budget?
I
And he
appreciate this
makes a
question.
comment
Yeah.
here,
Yeah.
podcasting is best done when you fairly criticize your own political tribe. Now, I take issue with that because although I have run for the Greens in the past, and although I have worked on things within the party, currently I'm not a partisan person. I am not
Yeah.
uh, embedded in any party as a candidate. I am not in a paid position with a party, and you know, just a little while ago, I was actually contributing to a committee for TJ Harvey, who ran for the Liberals. So I'll poke you a little bit, Darcy, but you are running for the Greens.
Yes, partisan for sure. And
You
like
are partisan.
I
Yep.
think it's fair to say that, and I think that
Yeah.
that is a great comment, and I was really happy to see it, and I responded right away to it because I think this is important to talk about and not to hide behind these things and not to create smoke and mirrors around it or act like I am nonpartisan. Like I am
Mm,
fully partisan, and there's reasons for that. And I think that everyone can make that choice, right? Like, but having a podcast, I still think that I'm permitted and allowed to have a podcast and have a certain political leaning and be honest
mm,
about it. So I appreciate that. And while I do adore David Kuhn and think that he has so many things right, he doesn't walk on water. We're all human. We are all, fallible entities, if you will. So what I would say about the state right now of where the Greens are at on the budget, I love the feedback that they've given because I agree with a lot of it, which is like there's not enough healthcare spending. That was made very clear on the tour that both he and Susan actually did a healthcare related cross provincial tour to talk to frontline workers and people in the medical space about what the issues are. And I think David's estimation, the Green Party's estimation was we need another 200 to $300 million invested, not an extra $2 million
mm.
invested into the med space. But one thing I think David and the Greens could be a lot stronger on, and one I hope to advocate for, is stronger housing policy and putting numbers on what some of these things look like, right? Like we'll talk a little bit more about Justin Trudeau's announcement from today, but ultimately the province has a lot of levers they can pull, and there's a lot of things that we can do to strengthen the housing piece when it comes to the budget, including like beefing up the residential tribunal. There's a massive wait list for people to get hearings about the situations that they find themselves in. So how do you double the capacity of that organization? How do you make sure that nonprofits are getting first right of refusal for land purchases, building purchases, things like that, when there are stories that we could tell you about nonprofits losing housing projects to the open market? Like, how do you make sure that we can invest in that? We're seeing some stuff out of Fredericton where the municipality is actually putting aside money to secure lands for affordable housing. Where could the Greens advocate for setting aside money to secure land for affordable housing? So stuff like that, where there needs to just be more meat on the bone of the housing piece, and like how do we propose that, even though god it's like a snowball's chance in hell when it comes to the Higgs government and getting any of that across a finish line. How do we have a strong voice in that piece is what I would say to the answer to that question.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm looking at Twitter here, and we see a budget priorities heading into
Mhm.
the budget. What was David Kuhn's position for the Greens? Finance mechanisms for nurse practitioners to work collaborative care teams and solo practices, establish community health centers staffed by collaborative care teams in rural areas, fund New Brunswick Housing Corporation to support non-market housing projects, implement universal lunch program, and establish a guaranteed livable income. Now, I like just about everything in there.
Of
But what
course.
I but what I don't like about the Greens on this front is that they're missing the mark when it comes to the cost of living conversation.
Right.
Right now, when we talked about it with Sean Rouse, for those of you who remember, and saw the different graphics that we poured through from Angus Reid. When you poll New Brunswickers about those top issues, we're not far off from other places in the rest of this country where the cost of living has become a major impediment. And although there is no question that things like funding non-market housing and a universal
Mm-hmm.
lunch program and a guaranteed livable income are things that those of us who are nuanced and those of us who
Yeah.
know these policies and know sort of the realities of people know that they would impact the cost of living for people. What doesn't happen is the vast majority of us who own a home, work a full-time position, we're not seeing anything in there for us.
I think
right?
we're missing the food piece too. Like we have a milk board that sets the price of milk. We have a meat, like same with meat, same with like same with these staples. So where is some of that, I guess, energy around making sure that we are capping food prices so those remain affordable, especially for essentials? Like I think that again, meat on the bone kind of idea that we have those levers to pull in New Brunswick. Like we have the highest milk prices, I think, in the country. That was a Bob Jones story from not too long ago.
Yep.
So
Yeah. Wasn't he in the commercial himself?
yeah,
Or
it was we all the kids were, all my nieces and nephews were in this CBC story, all drinking milk, because it's dairy is one of those staples, right? And we have that control. And I know the Greens made comments when that hearing was going on. But we again let them up the prices again. And same when it comes to NB Power, like the 13% increase we're seeing there, like that needs to be addressed and full on confronted with how taxpayers are paying for the debt of an organization that went off the rails for many years.
Yeah, from a communications perspective and from a strategic engagement perspective with the public, the issue is never are the Greens hammering on things in the legislature, because boy, do they hammer on things well when it comes to the failures of government to tax industry, to treat industry the same as people, like you're talking about energy rebates and stuff. They do a great job of that. They just don't necessarily connect with the average. I'll say average. My perspective on what an average New Brunswicker looks like is colored for sure. It's different than probably anybody else's. But when I think of an average New Brunswicker, I think of somebody who, lives in a house. We know that the majority of New Brunswickers live in a house that they own. 45% are renters, or so, around 40%, depending on where you're at, what urban area. But right around there. And we know that majority of New Brunswickers work a job, and we know that the majority of New Brunswickers as a household make around $65,000 a year, the median, I guess. So I'm treating it as a statistical average, Joe, and I just think that a lot of people right now they've bought, and we're going to talk about this, the carbon tax. They bought into the carbon tax. They bought into that the carbon tax is the root of all evil, that it's Justin Trudeau's fault, that it's their problem. Like, you just don't see David putting things in the window from the Green perspective that are going to isolate that message and make their position different.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, the star power of politics is Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre. Whether you love them or hate them, they are the ones that the majority of people know, followed closely by people like Jagmeet Singh, Maxime Bernier, Elizabeth May, like the leaders of the federal parties, really. And so
that's why you're hearing so much from the PCNB about the federal parties. Like, they're hanging their hats on, like, Pierre Poilievre's is the way forward and Justin isn't. And like that has nothing to do with provincial politics. And Sean's point, healthcare is at the top, which is fully provincial.
That's the number one. Yeah.
So if you're over here like talking carbon tax and talking gas prices, like, but mostly like 70-some% of New Brunswickers care more about healthcare. Like the Higgs government is ignoring 70-some% of New Brunswickers' top concern.
Yep.
So
I know it. And so Darcy, that shout out goes to you. I thank you for commenting and asking us about it. I will add one thing that I liked about the Greens is that they broke down what they wanted, what their perspective of what was needed in the healthcare budget versus what we got. So when they talk about it, they say, look, just on healthcare, we needed 70 million for community health centers. We got 20. We needed $192 million for healthcare. We got or for recruitment and retention, we got 1.4. 60 million for electronic records, we got 22. 60 million for prevention, we got 5. Long-term care beds, we needed 160 million, we got 18. So like the green perspective on what was needed in the healthcare budget is similar to the liberal messaging. And the liberal messaging, I got an email in my inbox, and liberals will say this, like last week, Higgs government tabled its 2024 budget. It's no surprise. It's another disappointment. The new spending on healthcare for this year increased by only $1.6 million. Despite the PCs touting it as the biggest healthcare budget in New Brunswick history, if we do the math, that's only $1.89 per New Brunswicker. And certainly Sean Rouse mentioned that. So they're both taking some, important steps to address the government spin machine, which is, this is the biggest healthcare budget in history. Well, it's like, how couldn't it be? We've added 60-some thousand people to this province the past 3 years.
And that ratio, like 60,000 people increase, is not reflected in that budget, right?
No.
Like, you're not compensating for that increase. No. You're trying to spend like pennies on the dollar for the amount of people that you now have in the system. Full stop.
But we've got a great credit score.
Oh, gross. Gross.
Okay, now let's go on to the next question that came up from last week that we didn't get to. And that took a lot longer to go through than I thought. So we'll just keep banging them out here.
Yeah.
Is a government supposed to present all of its plan? This comes from Sheila Ebbett. Is a government, thank you, Sheila Ebb on Twitter. And, Twitter's where we get a lot of feedback. So, guys, if you're on Twitter, please follow us, like us, comment on our stuff. We love to see it. Is the government supposed to present all of its planned spending in the budget, or is it allowed to dribble out spending over the course of the year?
So this would be the Higgs government's election budget, if you will. So this is the one that's supposed to dazzle and make us all really excited. And I heard some funny commentary in the community just being like, if this is his election budget, like, what's the platform going to be? Because it really wasn't that dazzling. But, there is chances throughout the year to increase spending on things and make certain decisions. But ultimately, this is their guidebook. This is supposed to be the thing that governs their year. But, there's always chances to make exceptions, but it's very rare that ever happens, as far as I know.
Yep.
Yeah.
And when we look at the budget itself, the thing about the budget is they always edit what their predictions are versus what their adjustments are. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Little lag there, folks, for those of you watching and listening. But yeah, I wanted to bring up an actual visual of the difference here, because the question, do they roll it all out? Sorry for those of you at home, looks a little bit funny right now, but this, you can see, has those revisions. So if we look at what was estimated just for healthcare, because that is the top issue for folks, it was $3.5 billion that was budgeted for last year, for 2023 going into 2024. They revised that to 3.796 billion because they had to spend more because it, needs. And this year it's 3.798. So we're looking at a difference of $2 million, $500,000, $2.5 million, let's say, from what the revised one was.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, folks, yes, you can absolutely change. You can dribble the announcements out over the year and whatnot. So thank you for that question, Sheila. Any comment on that, Sheila? Or Joanna, for Sheila's question?
No, it's one of those ones where, we just spent probably like 5 minutes trying to figure that out behind the scenes, because they make it really difficult to make that clear to you whether or not that's possible. So very good question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and then finally we had a question from LMM, Newfie Mainlander. That's funny. And they say this, they keep bragging about the biggest healthcare budget, yet they are not adjusting for population growth or inflation. And that is so true. If we look at the per capita spending, it is pretty clear that we're looking at a pretty significant tie for 2000 or we're tied in per capita spending, adjusted for inflation, by the way. Looks like 2011 is what we're coming
Ooh.
in at. So
Mm.
I'm going to share this screen with everybody here because
Yeah, and that was the big realization across parties as well. And here's the
yeah,
proof.
lots of comments on there, right? So you
Yeah.
can see the screen here for those of you at home. Here's your adjusted for inflation component, per capita. And that's the real number that matters because, who cares if you've got the biggest healthcare budget in history, like if you
And
added
the
60.
worst service and
Yeah.
whatnot. Like I'm right now in a pretty consistent healthcare regime with the regional hospital, all for good reasons. But it's one of these things where I keep hearing, and I know that the Liberals and the Greens heard this on their healthcare tour. It's worse than ever. We can't keep on going like this. What are we gonna do? Like it's just bad. And so when you go around saying things like that, it becomes extra cringy because there's all these healthcare professionals that are out there crying for support, and you're giving them like peanuts in response as a government and basically gaslighting them and saying like here's the biggest budget ever when we can categorically prove that is untrue. So it's really unfair to healthcare workers, and it's unfair to Horizon, who's just been like given the envelope and told to like fix everything when they're asking for something different, as far as I know. It just feels really unfair. And so all smoke and mirrors, in my opinion, and it's really unfairly characterizing the situation that we're currently in.
Yeah, and so we talked about this last week. The conservatives don't really have a great position to hold here.
Mm-hmm.
The government spin machine talking about this being the biggest healthcare budget in history is hilarious. It's, nobody's going to believe that. Everybody who's going to the ER next week is going to know that they took 7 hours when they were a kid it took 4 or 2 in my case. Like we talked about that. So
Which you
whether
can read in Kelly's report, right? You can walk through where the spending was decreased by Liberals, first off, throughout the last 30 years and how it all broke, right? Like that document is excellent for understanding why we're in the pickle we are with healthcare.
yeah. So that graphic I just showed you all comes from a good, I guess, engager online for the political landscape here in New Brunswick. Chris, his name is, or at Halloway Orchard, and he cites his data where he got it from and all that, which is just great to see. That is it for the Q&A. Thank you for all the people who wrote in. I'm sorry that we didn't get to those questions last week with regards to the budget. I was
You got
going to
my
ask.
answers instead. It's just so great.
It's even better. You got Joe's. And I'm sorry to those of you who who wrote in and we didn't get to it at that moment. At the same time though, we also covered your hot take here, Joe. So I don't think
Yeah.
there's any reason to jump into your hot takes on the budget. I think we can be pretty clear about what your perspective is on the budget.
I'm not having a great time with it. And I think, like I said earlier, if this is an election budget, they are going to have some come to Jesus moments, I think, when they hit the doors.
Oh, sorry about that, folks. Having some weird internet problems here. So if you kind of lost Joe there, anyway, first part of the show was talking about the Q&A from last week. Let's get into the new stuff this week. So what is up with the carbon tax?
So overwhelmed with the carbon tax stuff lately. It's making me very depressed about society, because what is frustrating me the most about it is that y'all are being duped by people who are a lot richer than you, tricking you into thinking the carbon tax and Justin Trudeau are responsible for everything. there's categorical proof about how corporate greed is responsible for inflation and responsible for all the price increases and affordability problems you're seeing. There is unregulated free market nonsense that's taking over our grocery chains, our communications. And I've been saying this on here for, oil and gas for since the beginning, that this has been a misnomer. We've had our carbon tax, a climate tax, whatever you want to call it, since 2007. And it was only since 2019 that you started getting money back. So conservatives brought this in, and they love to forget to tell you that. They absolutely love to forget to tell you that. And the David Suzuki Foundation's coming out right now saying like this exact same thing that I'm saying. So it was really disappointing to see the New Brunswick Liberals jump on that bandwagon, because that means 4 rebates per year will not come to New Brunswickers if we go down that road and canceling the carbon tax. There's a much bigger thing at play here when it comes to our gas prices, and that's what I like to call the Higgs adjuster tax. So there was a chance, and you might all have not seen this or missed it because it was really a blip in the sort of news cycle, where the premier went to the Energy and Utilities Board, which sets those gas prices for us, and decided and begged them to not put the onus onto industry for the tax adjustment that was going to happen, and put it onto the consumers. So we're paying more gas in New Brunswick than many other provinces, because those other provinces put it onto industry to pay, not the consumer. And so now everyone's getting these two things confused, thanks to the Steve Outhouse and Higgs political spin machine. Blame Trudeau, blame Trudeau, blame Trudeau. Listen, Trudeau has all kinds of things. None of us are infallible people. Like, there's lots of things you can be mad about Trudeau with, but this one is not it. If we're going to be mad at Trudeau, it should be that he's not capping food prices for Canadians and letting these grocery, oligarchs continue to run hog wilds. Like, there's people, this was so interesting. In the US, friends of mine, I posted about a $25 food buying club that I'm in, which gave me like a bit of fruit and veggies for a couple weeks, and was like, this is $25. And they're like, Joanna, this is like $10 to $15 in Illinois or in New York or in Maine. Like, what are you talking about? What is going on back home? That is not because of gas prices. That is because of greed.
Yeah, so let's fact check some of this
Yes,
for sure.
please.
For our thank you for the beef. If anybody's listening to this podcast and you can remember, what was that show? What's your beef, or what's the beef?
Yes.
What was it?
I think that's what it was.
Yeah, but it came from it was from a show. Anyway, that was the 90s.
Where's the beef?
What's your beef? What's the beef? How much is the beef is the question this week. At
Yes.
any rate, let's fact check some of this, because I know what you mean. My God, is there ever a lot of low-hanging fruit and low energy thinking around the carbon price piece online. It's like right now, if I were to go online and here's a good test I could do. I put a big, long, like articulate, but tried to like simplify it. As I even ran it through an editing device to try to like make sure it was a good voice for a call to action around housing, and a comment about housing that happened after 2 individuals passed away in encampment fires here in St. John, tragically. And I put that online, and I got some play. I got like 40 likes. I got like some shares and stuff, and it's not all about the likes, but it just shows about our consciousness on these social media things. To your point about the carbon price, there was another post on Loyalist City News Chasers here in St. John about Wayne Long having, I won't say all the words, but having this position on the carbon tax, and Justin Trudeau, him being in bed. Like, it was a scathing joke. It was a very sexual joke that was made on Loyalist City News Chasers in this picture of Wayne. That got like 90 shares, like 200 likes. And I'm like, this is what's wrong with our society. So I get your concern. I get your beef. We have a lot of our population that aren't listening to us or trying to engage with us or have an hour conversation each week about some of this stuff. They're happy to share a simplified reductionist comment and call it the problem.
And conservatives
But
know that. They know that.
they bank on it, actually. All parties, all leaders in some way, people who are what we would call populists, people who are populists in a negative way, in a bad way, because there are good populists as well. But people who are trying to cash in on your busyness are trying to put slogans and headlines in front of you to get you nodding your head. And then once your head is nodding, it's really hard to disagree. It's like getting on a train you can't get off of.
Oh, can I make one more point about the whole carbon tax thing? So,
Yep.
What you need to understand is that billionaires want this to be happening this way. And if you look at the lobbyists that support Polyev, like they're lobbyists for Loblaws, they're lobbyists for Metro, they're lobbyists for oil and gas, they're lobbyists for, big communications companies. There's a whole thing going on with Bell right now. They're going to be in court here for laying off 4,800 people after taking a ton of government money. They want you looking over here while they're over here doing all these other nefarious things. So if you're not concerned about them and you're more concerned about Justin, they win. They're the winners. And
Yep.
they're like thumbs upping this whole situation of us down here arguing. So like we're not asking the right questions and instead going after someone who, like, what is it, 1% to 2%? I'm excited for your fact check of how much like carbon tax actually adjusts inflation, because there is a number for that.
Let's do two parts here.
Okay.
And the first part will be to discuss the history of carbon pricing in Canada very quickly. And I'm sorry for those of you who are at home. You're just going to be watching me for the next 2 minutes read an article. That article is from brightspot.co, and it's a history lesson in carbon pricing. And I am trying to find the author is Sheldon Fernandez. He's the director of strategy and innovation at Brightspot. So this is somebody who has to be fact checked. This is somebody who has to he has to at least meet a certain proof of burden. He can't just put something out there and say it's true because I say so, which is a lot of what Pierre Poilievre puts out about things. And, I say it's bad and I say Justin Trudeau is the devil and Stalin and Hitler, and therefore it's true. You see that ridiculous stuff. And I hope to God our listeners can see through that. And even if you're a Pierre Poilievre supporter, I hope to God that your correspondence with the Conservative Party is like, can you guys please stop trying to toss red meat to the animals out there who don't care to fact check any of this and lead us down the garden path of polarization? Can you please stop? Because I think there's room for both. But anyway, the history lesson is this. In 2000, the early days of carbon pricing, 92 countries from all around the world, they met in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I'm paraphrasing. They came up with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the UNFCCC. It was an international treaty that set the objective to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. In 97, we get Kyoto. And a lot of people will remember that. That was around the Chrétien era, was signed by a majority of countries, including Canada. It intended to limit the emission of greenhouse gas emissions internationally. So there we go. A framework known as Cap and Trade was put forward. Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien signed it, the Kyoto Protocol, but failed to introduce policies to achieve Canada's committed emissions. Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin, after that, also failed to make any substantial policy suggestions to address climate change. And then the Conservative Party under Stephen Harper was elected in 2006. Harper strongly opposed Kyoto, which required that industrialized countries reduce emissions, but not developing countries, including China. And so carbon pricing became a major issue during the 2008 federal election campaign. As a main component of his environmental platform, Liberal leader at the time, Stéphane Dion, committed to carbon price. However, the plan failed to gain traction with Canadians, and the Liberal Party was resoundingly defeated by Harper. The Conservative Party's platform included the promise of cap and trade, right? Cap and trade being a bit of a different approach to carbon, like emissions, putting gas into the atmosphere unnaturally, which promotes a heating of the planet. Let's call that the definition. That different approach is called cap and trade. Quebec certainly took that on in step. As it appeared at the time, the States would pass a similar plan, but Canada formally withdrew by 2011, and by 2015, the Conservative government was widely criticized for failing to implement any meaningful action on climate change, and the election of Justin Trudeau's Liberal government marked a new chapter for Canada and the climate change mitigation efforts. So you're not wrong. The first mention of any kind of sort of carbon interaction, whether we call it cap and trade or carbon pricing, came from the Conservative Party platform of '08. And Stephen Harper certainly picked up the rally call of Alberta, which came not long after that. And so,
but they did implement a tax, if I am not wrong. Like cap and trade is a tax on
it never actually came. It was in their platform, and it never actually came to, according to what I'm seeing here, and from what I know, it never actually came to a tax. It was a system that they developed a plan for, that they put in their platform, and that they applauded Alberta for. They applauded Alberta for their climate change and emissions management fund.
Right. So there was public
and
fund
Alberta
changes.
became the first jurisdiction in North America to put a price on carbon. So long before everybody else, Alberta, who is widely known for the most enriched province in this country and one of the most rich jurisdictions in North America for its oil industry, put a price on carbon. And Stephen Harper applauded that, ran on the platform for it, for sure. But it wasn't until 2015 that and a little after 2015, that a national sort of regulation was put in place for carbon pricing. So you're right. It was Stephen Harper that got us talking about it at the national level. It was Alberta that passed it first at the provincial level. And the Paris agreements came in 2015. So it's now unpopular because people's purchasing power has dramatically declined.
Right.
And so your position, from what, if I understand it, is that they've got us over here arguing about a tax, while certain billionaires and the ultra wealthy in this nation, which is an indisputable fact, we do know that every single year wealth inequality increases. So the people,
you also have record-breaking profits. I think that needs to be very clear too. Like these are astronomically different than the profits that were being made back in 2015, back in 2019, back in 2007.
Yes.
So
there's less competition.
Yes.
Weirdly enough, so for some reason, the open market has not created more competition. It's created less competition.
More mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah. And more monopolies, which create more oppression.
Yes.
I can agree with you on that. And certainly if anybody is interested in looking at a recent article, the title is "Corporate Greed, Not Wages, is Behind Inflation, and It's Time for Price Controls." That's by Robert Reich, who was the former Minister of Labor under Bill Clinton in the United States. Pretty rare for anybody from the United States to call for this type of stuff, except Bernie Sanders.
And you mentioned an economist who is apologizing, who was very pro growth, if you will.
Yes, we'll get to that.
He's part of this movement too.
Yeah, but before I go too far off the carbon price, because I think we should try to touch that if we have time.
Yeah.
I want you to let's dispel some of the real myths here around the carbon price. So to do that, we're gonna put a person or a family in New Brunswick, and we're gonna talk about what they pay in carbon price and under the carbon tax versus what they get. So my first question to you is: you're a person. Are you a single person, or are you with a partner in New Brunswick? Let's just you create the scenario. We'll do a couple of these.
So okay, let's do partnered with 2 children.
Okay, rural New Brunswick or in the city, in a municipality, CMA, a central
Yeah,
metropolitan area.
let's do rural for our rural friends.
How many children? Two.
Two, yeah.
Okay, what's the household income?
Ooh, let's be like you say, an average New Brunswicker, and it'd be around $65,000.
$65,000. Give me 1 second here. So we've got rural New Brunswick, we've got a partner, we've got $65,000, we've got two children. How much fuel are you using in gasoline for your car a month? To give you an idea, your car, which is a newer car, would currently consume, with your current mileage, about 100 liters a month.
Okay. Is that a rural estimation?
I think rural would probably be like double or triple that.
Yeah. Okay. So then let's
Because
just
they have a
give.
lot further to go to work, a lot
Yeah.
further to go to groceries, a lot further to go to see their friend and all
So
that.
let's do 350.
350 liters a month. And let's say it's gasoline, not diesel. And let's say how are we heating our house? We're not using natural gas, we're not using propane. There's no carbon tax on heating oil anymore. So that's removed. There's not a lot of natural gas in rural New Brunswick. There is in the cities, and I don't know a lot of people that use propane. So let's assume people are getting either wood fire or electric baseboard.
Mm-hmm.
The carbon tax with this person, we'll do one more after this. Carbon tax on your monthly fuel purchases is $50.
Mm-hmm.
The estimated cost increase in the other things that you would buy, which would be things around like that are indirectly pay, and there are indirect to that. So I'm reading here, estimates come from two sources: the Parliamentary Budget Office and research paper by economist Jennifer Winter, Brett Dalter, and G. Kent Fellows. Income is used as a proxy for spending and estimate how much you indirectly pay in the carbon tax through cost increases in the non-fuel goods and services you purchase. So your monthly fuel purchases would be $50. Your rebate would be $0 based on this estimation. So in this case, you would be losing $50 a month.
There's no rebate for that.
No rebate for that.
That doesn't make any sense.
Well, because sorry. You know what I didn't do? I apologize. I didn't click New Brunswick.
Okay.
Two kids. I am so sorry, everybody. Two kids, 65,000. Because some provinces don't have rebates because they've instigated their own. There we go. Carbon tax is $50. Your estimated cost increase on the other things you buy is $24.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's like not groceries, but some of the transportation services that you might get around that, and your rebate would be $61. So in your case, you'd be losing $13 a month.
Yeah. And that is sort of like the sin tax argument, which is that.
Yep. And that's not.
Yeah.
And that's driving a lot. 350 liters is a pretty inefficient vehicle. And let's not forget that money is going into a fund that doesn't just go to pay politicians. That fund is there to fund green investments by companies and by people. So, for example, I participated in the Greener Homes Fund. And the New Brunswick NB Power retrofit program. I was able to spend, I think I spent $14,000 on retrofits for my house: outside insulation, attic insulation, basement insulation. Really improved the efficiency of my house, and I got about $9,000 back. Yeah. Pretty big deal. That's where that money it goes to initiatives like that, especially the Greener Homes Fund, but also to big industry so they can retrofit. Yeah. One more example. Let's do a city.
Single city dweller.
Single city dweller. Let's say two children, same money.
Yeah, same money.
Same money, but say you got two children, you're living on your own.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we're gonna be driving a lot less because we're living in a city. So let's put it down to what our number is. Mm-hmm. Or like 150 liters. Carbon tax is $21. Your estimated cost increase in the other things you buy, It's 24, your rebate's 59. That means you're making 14 bucks. So in either scenario, right, there's a small loss and a small gain. And what we're not talking about when we do this is what is the provincial tax on gasoline? What is the provincial tax on HST, on goods and services that the province has control over?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the point to this, like exercise, is it is low hanging, cheap thinking to look at the carbon tax, which has only been around since which has been around 2015, and yes, is going to go up, but it's really cheap to look at that as the driving force behind inflation and your costs going up, when we know that companies like Loblaws and companies like Sobeys and companies, list could go on. I mean, Apple, Google, Tesla, like the stock market is doing better than ever, and
They'll
record
use
profit.
they've proven that any excuse, even the pandemic, um, for price increases, they'll use, because they know that the average consumer is not going to dive deep and dig into the reasons as to why. They'll go, oh well, there's supply shortages and there's this
Mm,
and that. But once you start digging around and you see these record profits every time, every quarter, you know that there is a boardroom somewhere where they're sitting around and trying to think of new ways to spin this kind of information. Like,
yep.
that is just the way it's always worked, and it's encouraged.
So
So,
let's cap this off a little bit. We didn't get to the Justin Trudeau Bill of Rights for renters piece, but around this piece, the Liberals have in New Brunswick, Susan Holt's government, or government to be, government in waiting, whatever you want to call it, the opposition party, the Liberals, they have a challenge, because despite you and I trying to nuance the conversation around the carbon tax and say, hey, hold on a sec, folks, it's not just the carbon tax, although that may be a poorly arranged system.
mm-hmm.
Whatever we think about it, there's all kinds of other players here that are gouging you for cash that we're not doing anything about, that we need to do something about. Despite our efforts, a lot of people don't believe that. There are the political forces like Pierre Polyev, which get millions of dollars to put information in front of us. And, especially when we're not looking at a strong media landscape anymore, we don't all
I
agree on
know.
the facts and all that, whatever. Not a lot of people buy into that. A lot of people are buying into the anti-carbon tax. So that ties Justin Trudeau to Susan Holt. And if Susan Holt is going to try to beat Blaine Higgs, how are we going to accomplish that when they have the same party name? Do we think that Susan, because she recently came out against Justin Trudeau on the carbon tax,
Mm-hmm.
what are your thoughts on how that positions her?
I think I said that earlier, that I'm not a fan of that move, and I'd like to get to your exchange as well, because I think it speaks a lot to how the Liberals kind of approach more controversial issues. Um,
What do you mean,
it's
like a weather vane?
Well, a little bit, yeah. It sort of felt like, well, okay, well, since people don't seem happy about this carbon tax, we're gonna go over here and go in this direction. Where, like I said before, like, talk about the food prices, talk
Mm,
about putting regulations on big food corporations, because I really do think a lot of this comes down to food. When we can't afford our basic necessities, that's when everybody starts to go a little cuckoo.
yep.
And so,
Housing,
like,
especially.
housing and food. So, and then, like, all other luxuries are out the door, right? So one
Mm,
thing, like, and I would love everyone to go research the new proposal by the Liberals about the renters bill of rights, because one thing they want to do is at least give us credit on our credit scores for paying rent. Like, that's a
mm-hmm.
great basic level thing. But other than that, like, no one's talking about the food stuff, and no one's talking about taking on Galen Weston, or subsidizing the producers, at least, like, that local level, who are trying to gouge us, and supporting them. So,
Yeah,
by
I mean, to
going,
your
yeah,
point, a few podcasts ago, we had Fred LaForge on here,
yeah,
and we came up with a pretty haphazard, but like supported. Like, this is a guy who really understands the food systems and has
yeah,
been spending his life trying to get fresh produce and food into places that don't have access to them, what we call food deserts.
Yeah.
Social enterprise around that, a company around that. Like, the guy isn't in it to make millions. He's in it to make enough to keep the wolf off the doorstep and to put food in people's bellies.
Hmm.
And I look at that system and we said, look, like, what if we just came with 40 staples that everybody could have access to and afford?
Yeah.
It's almost like a guaranteed livable income for food, like a guaranteed, food supply or something
Yeah.
that you can get access to for a really affordable rate or something.
Incentivizing those, the growth of those
Incentivizing
things. Yeah.
nutrition and
Yeah.
healthcare, and food is healthcare. Then what does a food grade system look like? As his question was, I think is great. What I don't see the Liberals doing, and I think we're going to have to wait until next week to dive into it on the housing piece, but on this gas tax piece, on like they're hammering the Conservatives on, hey, well, you guys passed on the provincial gas tax stuff from the EUB to the consumer, and you could have put it on industry, and you did.
Which is a great point, and one that's been made 100 times by
Good.
the Greens. Yeah, I
It's
love
good.
it. But that's where you need to hang your hat. Is there?
But not just there, though, to your point, we got to
Mhm.
put bigger things in the window.
Yeah.
And why are there no comments being made about the profiteering that's occurring on the monopolized food system,
Mhm.
on the monopolized housing system, and on the healthcare piece? Like, to the Greens' point, Darcy saying, "Hey, you guys are partisan, and like, well, why aren't you talking about you're not talking about your own party?" It's like, in this case, our party put some real numbers in the window for what ought to have been spent on healthcare. We didn't
Yeah.
see that from the Liberals. All we got was criticism.
Yeah.
And that tactic looks eerily similar to Pierre Polyev, where we don't see alternatives from Pierre about how we're going to move our society off of a fuel source that pollutes our environment.
Yeah. No, like my favorite gal on TikTok, Nitty, she said, like, I can't wait to see what Polyev says about this renters' bill of rights. Like, let's go. And it's true.
Yeah, and they need to fight. Like the federal Liberals at this point in time, Curse of Politics. If you don't listen to that podcast, please go listen. But their title was "They Need to Fight," and I agree. It's like the federal Liberals need to fight. The provincial Liberals with Susan, they need a fight that they look ambitious on.
Yeah. Show us
For
the
them,
solutions.
for them to cruise to victory, like they're not putting anything big in the window. And I had a big debate with Susan Holt. You can go on Twitter and read it if you'd like. We'll get to it next week when we have a chance to digest some of this housing stuff. I had a big debate personally with Susan on some of these housing policy ideas to set us apart. And Susan seems stuck on semantics. And that sounds like a great slogan. Susan is stuck on semantics. But she's saying, well, I'm saying the same thing as you, but they're different words. I'm like, no, some of these policy positions are very specific. They do different things. And we can't argue with the fact that real estate and leasing is this country's largest producer of GDP.
Yeah. And this actually leads to another mailbag that we need to get to, which is comes from Fred about what might be the economic superclusters that could exist in New Brunswick. What could be the differential economies that we do invest in that New Brunswick could take on instead of being a tourist destination, right? So, or housing, the cheapest place to live in Canada. We were on a list on TikTok recently as the cheapest place to live in Canada. So,
yet St. John has the highest rent increases in the country and some of the lowest wage increases in the country. Exactly. So it's like, okay, everything needs to be considered here. Just the fact you can buy a house for less than $300,000 in New Brunswick doesn't mean that the people who live here and work for the companies that are here can afford to buy those still, right?
It's all connected.
It's all connected. We're going to get to that next week. So
thank you,
we're out of time this week. Thank you all for tracking along with us with this hodgepodge edition of Mailbag, Carbon Tax, History, Politics, Budget, all of it.
I love it.
Yes, and we will be back to you next week to talk about those economic superclusters and whatever the hell that means.
Oh yeah, that's some words.
And we'll get back to the housing stuff, because I'm sure we're going to see some fallout from Justin Trudeau's announcement today. Everybody have a good week. We'll see you all in 7 days.